When Stacey Simms' son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, she turned to podcasts to learn more. But when she couldn't find what she was looking for, her husband suggested she create her own show. 9 years on, and Diabetes Connections has more than 600 episodes. Stacey is also the host of Diabetes Connections Type 2, as well as the author of The World's Worst Diabetes Mom and its sequel, Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom. I connected with Stacey over on Threads, and in this conversation, you're going to hear what she would do differently if she were launching a podcast today, how she has successfully monetized her show, and how she has connected with her listeners off air. I'm Alison Fraser, host of Women Who Podcast, the show for side hustling women who are ambitious but time limited. Each week, I bring you real life stories and actionable tips to help you create and grow your own podcast. Let's get into it. So, welcome on, Stacey. I'm excited to hear about your podcasting career to date.
Thank you so much for having me, Alison. I'm excited to be here. This will be fun.
I found you on Threads, which we were just talking off air before. It's kind of like the new Twitter. I'm quite new to it, but I'm discovering lots of other podcasters on there. So I'm so glad that we were able to connect. And I've since learned heaps more about you on another thread about using your degree in real life. We both have broadcast journalism experience, but you don't really have to have that experience to be a podcaster, do you, Stacey?
You really don't. I mean, that was a funny thread on Threads about using your degree or what your degree was and what you do now, because you find that most people do not use what they went to school for in the exact way, right? I mean, we always use what we learn. But like you, I'm broadcast journalism and policy studies, where I have a dual major. And I did it. I went out and I was a TV and radio reporter on the local level for many years. And it was when that stopped for me. I left the business in 2013, 2014, and I started my podcast in 2015. I think it's just something, I don't know, radio people are kind of weird. And I think if you're truly, truly a radio or broadcast kind of person, you just need an outlet like this. But if you want a podcast, you do not need to be a crazy radio person like me. So let's get that out of the way first. I don't mean to say that you need to have a broadcasting background or be a broadcasting professional, because you really don't.
What do you think you do need to have a podcast?
Well, I think there's a couple of different reasons to start. If you want to have a successful podcast that is truly like a broadcast, is there for a standalone purpose, it is a thing unto itself, then you do need passion and presence, and you really need to be very reliable and consistent. If you're doing a podcast for other reasons, though, like you have a business and you want people to learn more about it, or you have a book and you want to do a 5-part series just talking about that. I mean, there's so many different reasons to podcast. If it's going to be something like the others I mentioned, then, you don't need to worry about your delivery being perfect and consistently posting your podcast on Thursdays or that kind of thing. If it's an adjunct to something else, then the goals and the purpose and the productivity are completely different. And if it's for fun, and you just want to get together and talk to your friends about Dungeons and Dragons or movies or tell childhood stories that you want to air publicly for some reason, then it's just for fun and you don't need anything but a microphone. So yeah, there are lots of reasons to have a podcast.
Yeah. Your podcast has been going, as you said before, for a very long time. Is it 2015? Can you tell us what it was that got you started down this path? You've got your broadcast journalism experience. You're out of that industry, but now you're podcasting.
Sure. Well, I've listened to podcasts for a very, very long time, since the days when, you had an iPod and you plugged it into your computer and you downloaded shows, which eventually we started calling podcasts, that portmanteau, that mushed together words of iPod and broadcast, podcast. So I always listened to podcasts. When my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2006, I turned to that medium, like what's out there. And there are a lot of great podcasts about diabetes, about different types of diabetes. There's medical podcasts, there's, ones by lay people. But I have a news background, and there wasn't one that had what I was looking for, which was news and interviews and technology and mental health and just there were a lot of people telling their personal stories, which is great, and I still listen to shows like that. But I wanted something where, like, I specifically remember walking my dog and listening to a podcast, and the person they were doing an interview, and the person said something, and it wasn't explained well. And there was an obvious point for a follow-up, and it wasn't asked. And I'm yelling, I'm walking myself down. Why didn't you? So then I realized I need to start my own show. And I was actually held up by about 6 months because I was afraid of the technology. It's easier than it was back then. But it still wasn't that difficult, but I didn't know how to do it. I'd always had a sound engineer or a producer or somebody else to press the buttons. So once I figured that out, yeah, I've done a weekly podcast since 2015. It's been amazing and fun and the most rewarding project of my professional career, hands down.
And still going strong, which is awesome.
Thank you.
With a topic such as type 1 diabetes, I guess a lot of people who talk about starting a podcast, one of their main concerns is running out of things to say. How can I keep this podcast going, a year from now? What if I run out of a topic? Type 1 diabetes, that is a very specific topic, but you've kept it going for such a long time, coming up for like almost 10 years, so 9 years of
Yeah.
episodes. How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep on having something new to say?
Well, I want to let's also go back at some point and talk about that feeling of I've got to do this forever, right? Let's come back and talk about that because you really don't have to with a podcast, and I think that's a mistake that many people make when they jump in. But but I'll answer what you asked, and that is, this is going to sound like very brandy, but I'm an organic part of the diabetes community. I live this life as a caregiver. So my son was diagnosed with type 1. My husband lives with type 2. My son is now 19 years old, so very independent, away at college. But I am in that community every day. I'm very involved in social media still, even though I think sometimes it's time to leave, but that's not diabetes fault. That's just social media fault. And when people find out I do it, and I have 2 podcasts now because I just started a show about type 2. When people find out I podcast about diabetes, they're so sad for me. Alison, it's so funny. They're like, oh, like, because with podcasting, you're supposed to be like, I talk about sports, or I talk about movies, or I yell about politics. Well, I talk about inspiration and information about diabetes. And they're like, oh, that's so nice of you. And the truth of the matter is, it's really interesting. So the short answer to your question is you must have passion. You have to be curious. You have to be willing to learn. You have to seek out interesting people. With type 1 diabetes, this is a condition. If you're not familiar, this is an autoimmune disease. So you can get it at any age. This is a real layperson definition. So, talk to your doctor. It's an autoimmune disease, can happen at any age. And it basically means your body is not producing insulin. So you need to inject or infuse with an insulin pump, insulin 24/7, or you will be dead within the week. I mean, I wish there were a way to say it in more nice, but that's pretty much the end of it. So people with type 1 diabetes and those who care for them, they look to the outside world like they're great. Like they live amazing lives. They go up Mount Everest. They're professional athletes. There's people on Broadway. There's movie stars. I mean, they're incredible because you can live very well with it. But the work that it takes, holy cow. It's an every hour of every day kind of thing. I mean, you can automate it a little bit. So on the show, we can talk about everything from mental health to technology to, currently there is, and I'm going to call it a product shortage, but there's an insulin shortage from Lilly Diabetes because they're not producing insulin in the vials. There's a Humalog and it's a long, I don't know when this is going to air, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But these are concerns that people have every single day. So because I'm a news podcast as well, I interview the CEO of a continuous glucose monitoring company. And I always tell people, like, you might see him on CNBC talking about stock prices. And you've all probably seen commercials for Dexcom and Libre now. They're very, very much advertised. The circle thing that goes in your arm, like most people are familiar with that now. But when I have them on my show, I ask them, what about adhesives? Are you measuring minute to minute or every 5 minutes? Why? What insulin pump systems do you work with? Are you listening to patients about where they want to wear these? Why is it approved on your arm and not your abdomen? You know, Sorry for the long answer. I'm obviously pretty passionate about it. And one of the really fun things is because I've been doing this so long, I've been able to watch products go from incubation to market. And that's really fun when you can talk to a company and say, you started here. Why did this change? Why did this launch now? And that's just it's just fun.
When you put it like that, there are a lot of topics. And as you say, you're in it. And so you'll always have questions or thoughts about the topic of diabetes. And so yeah, there is no end of stories really for your topic. And I guess that goes with, as you say, you've got to have that passion. And when you've got the passion, you can always find something new to talk about.
Yeah, and you've got to listen to your audience. I always ask, what would you like to hear about? I have several Facebook groups where people give me ideas. Whenever I have a company that's coming on, I'll say to my group, all right, we're talking to, this is a perfect example. There's a new pump called the Twist. It's got 2 I's in it, so I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. We're going to find out together. So I asked my group, what do you want to know about this insulin pump? And they had a million questions for me. So I love to pass those directly along to the CEO or the medical director or whoever I'm talking to. So if you ask your people, they will help guide you as well. I have a lot of people now people live with diabetes much longer than they used to. So I have a lot of folks who want to know more about Medicare and menopause and living well over the age of 70. Like, it's really cool.
That is a key component, though, for your podcast, isn't it? Knowing who your community are and having that direct relationship with them, asking them what they want to hear, and then putting those questions to your guests.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, within the community, there are further slices, parents of kids with type 1, parents of little kids with type 1, parents of adult children, adults themselves who have type 1, older people with type 1, athletes with type 1. I mean, I'm a general audience for that niche, but within that niche, there are these slices. It's really amazing. They have these athletes who live with diabetes are just incredible, and they're so disciplined. My show is, generally speaking, not the show for them because I am not amazing or disciplined. And again, I don't live with diabetes, but I have had some people on who've done amazing feats, and I always ask them, like, what's your advice? But it is a really good idea, whatever your subject is, if you kind of follow your audience and just always put them first, I think you really can't go wrong.
And coming at it from a purely selfish angle, I guess it's really helped you as the mum of a child with diabetes.
That is, that's like my little secret, although it's not really a secret. For the first couple of years of the show, I would say that all the time, right? Oh, this is the best. This is really why I started the show, so I could learn. And there's this thing that happens, when kids are teens with type 1, it's a difficult time of life anyway, right? I mean, it's just tough. It's really, really difficult with a condition that just completely messes up your hormones. I mean, it's insane. So you can hear me. My son was 10 or 11 when I launched the show. And in the first couple of years, I'm asking every guest, like, how did you get through it? What did your mom think? What did you do for this? And it's so funny to hear me. You can kind of follow our family's trajectory through. And the last couple of years, I barely talk. I mean, it's not a show about him and me. He's been on the show a few times, but it's specifically not a personal show. But in the last couple of years, you can kind of hear me worrying about him less. Yeah, I've learned a ton.
I say that's a good thing that you're worrying about him less.
It is a good thing. It is a good thing. And we've shared together I wrote 2 books about it. Like, what is actively helping us? What helps me let him be more independent? And I say that was when he was younger. I mean, he's an adult. He's 19 now. But what really helped us keep that relationship while he was still in the soup of all of it? And it's always fun when he comes on because he's very irreverent. And he's an open book. I'm very careful about what I share because, his story is not my story. But he's like, well, I'll take all the questions. I'm answering everything. So I always get a little nervous, like, maybe don't tell that story.
Yeah, kids, you never know what they're going to come out with. You started a second podcast on the back that you mentioned that your husband's type 2 diabetes. And I know a lot of people do get confused when they hear diabetes. They will just think of one type. So how important was it for you to start the second podcast?
I had been asked to start a type 2 podcast several times over the last couple of years by companies. And I always turned them down, mostly because and I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but the fact of the matter is, I'm very successful with my podcast. I sell my own advertising, I do my own social media, I do my own guest booking. So I didn't really need help from someone who was going to take all my revenue away from me. So that's the real answer. But also, I didn't really feel like there was a lot to say. I mean, there's tons to say about type 2, but I wasn't sure that community was looking for more answers. And I do think in the last 2 or 3 years, there is so much more that people with type 2 can do that is accessible and affordable for them in a way that was not. Once you had private insurers and Medicare stepping up to cover continuous glucose monitoring, if you use insulin in most cases right now, it's still you have to use insulin or have debilitating low blood sugar, but it'll get there for everybody with type 2 soon enough, in my opinion. Once you had that, and once you have these semaglutides, which people like to make fun of, or they're a buzzword. We're talking about Ozempic here and drugs like that. They are amazing for people with type 2 diabetes. And all of my friends had questions about type 2 diabetes and using these semaglutides and GLP-1 medications. So I thought, all right, it's time. Let's do it. So it's a slightly different show in that it's got really basic diabetes education at the beginning, because most people with type 2 get no education. They say, their general practitioner says, oh, your A1C is 7.8. Here's some metformin. I'll see you in 3 months. People with type 1, especially kids, not adults, unfortunately, you get 3 or 4 days of education in the hospital. You're assigned a diabetes educator. There are a lot of books and things you could read. Most of the people with type 2 are told, you did this to yourself. Too bad. Go home, take care of it, which is horrible and not the case for, the majority of people. There's so much misinformation out there. So I'm hoping to be a little bit more of an easy educational resource. I source everything I put out there. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not a medical professional. So I'll tell you, this is where I pulled this information from. I've translated from doctor into English. So we're going to just have a conversation. And then we talk about technology, CGMs. We do talk about diet, exercise, all the things that you have to do. But in a way, I hope is just a little bit less blame and shame and a little bit more, hey, let's take 25 minutes. I know you're getting an earful about this from your doctor, maybe even your husband or wife, well-meaning family members are yelling at you. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm just going to say, here's some information and do with it as you will. But I will tell you, Alison, launching a second podcast or launching any podcast these days is a lot tougher than it was in 2015. The field is crowded. People are, I don't know, people are busy. It's been really interesting. It's going really well, but it is harder than, it was hard back in 2015, but it was also more novel. I think people were like, ooh, podcasting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. If you were starting your podcast from scratch today, what would you do to get it off the ground? Is there anything you would have done differently?
Well, the advice I give everybody, and this goes back to your original, the point we were making earlier about I'm going to be in this for years and years and I've got to produce every week. The number one thing I tell people is plan to do 6 episodes. Because if you love it, you may keep going. If you hate it or it's not working for you, 6 episodes is great. Then you have a series. You've got a limited series. You did it. It's done, and put it out there. So I did that with the second show. I said, I'm going to do six episodes and we'll see what happens. And that's what I did. And I have kept going every week since. But I would do that. Would I do anything differently? It's difficult. The things I would like to do differently are the things I don't have time for, because I do it all myself. I do have an editor now and he's wonderful, but he kills me. He's always so mad at me because I still go in and edit myself a little bit before I send it to him. And he's like, don't do that. Just send it to me. Don't worry about it. But I'm such a control freak. So if you can have somebody to help you produce, right, book guests, because I also don't solicit guests. This is another thing. I'm super picky and I'm protective of my listeners. So with diabetes, I'm sure you can imagine the amount of snake oil and pitches that are nonsense that I get every single day. And I'm very protective. So I don't actually, I don't know, 99% of the time, I do not take pitches. That's not how I get my guests. I find something that's interesting and I reach out to them. So the long answer as I'm thinking about it is I would invent another me that I didn't have to pay, and I would have her do a lot of extra work for me. But the real answer is I would do 6 episodes and see what happens. And don't spend like a lot of money on technology. You need a simple microphone a USB microphone that you can plug into your computer is just fine.
I need to clone myself also, Stacey, because
Right? Oh,
there are so many other things I'd love to be doing, but there's only one of me.
yeah. I know, I know. It's tough. I'm looking to hire an assistant. I was working with a virtual assistant on social media last year, and it was fine. The problem was that I have learned I really need somebody who understands the diabetes community. I can't teach all of that. You really need to be
Mm.
part of it to kind of understand. And it's mostly about, I don't know if I should even be talking about this, but it's mostly about like what not to share.
Yeah.
Like I don't need social media with images that have like sugar cubes or headless obese people like you see on the news. I mean, it's terrible, terrible. So I don't want to teach somebody. So I'm looking for that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Gee, there are all those stereotypes, aren't there, about diabetes? So yeah, I mean, you'll have seen them all.
Well, there's a whole movement within the diabetes community it's around language matters and about the stereotypes. And, I don't do a lot of advocacy. I do a lot of reporting on it, and I've had them as guests many times. I guess I advocate just by being around. But yeah, I mean, it has opened my eyes. I used to spend so much time when my son was little, and people would say, like, what type of diabetes? And I would, oh, he doesn't have type 2. Like, whoa, he didn't do this to himself, trying to defend myself, But the truth of the matter is that we need to work as one community. Type 1, type 2, gestational diabetes, there are different types of diabetes. And if we don't all have our voices together, in the US, we're battling ridiculous healthcare costs and insurance costs. And we need to act together to make those things change. And we also need to recognize that these are basically the damage from these diseases comes from untreated high blood sugars. And that's the same across the board for all types of diabetes. So while I have different shows, because there are different aspects to these conditions for sure, I do think there's a lot more that we would have to do together to be successful. And so people will make fun of adults with type 2 diabetes in a way they would never think of doing to a child with type 1. Or even an adult with many other conditions. For some reason, it's one of the few conditions left that people can really feel comfortable saying, like, well, that's a plate of diabetes, right? Oh, diabetes on a stick. Look at that dessert. And, you don't get diabetes from eating too much sugar. Sorry, you don't.
Mm. No, well, thank you for raising that because, yeah, you do hear that just around and about and on social media and just in conversation. So it's all, as you say, language does matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Once you think about it, you find it everywhere.
Yeah. I suppose it's like that saying, when you buy a car and you don't think anyone else has got that kind of car, and then all of a sudden you see that car everywhere.
Right.
When you mentioned before that you have ad revenue on your podcast, so are you able to make money on your podcast? Is it paying for itself? How's that working for you?
Yeah, it's funny. So the short answer is yes, it more than pays for itself. It is what I do. It's my job. So what happened was I did not plan on making any money from my podcast. And about 3 months in, my husband said to me, I bet you could make some money. And I was like, it's not that kind of show. And he said, I bet you could. And I was like, well, I'm going to show you I can't. So, but I used to be a community blogger for a company named Animus, which is no longer in business. It wasn't my fault, but they were part of Johnson and Johnson. They made insulin pumps. And I talked to the people that I was blogging for at the time and said, I have this podcast and you should advertise on it. And they agreed. I said, I have no audience. I think I had 120 people who listened, to each episode. And I said, just stick with me. We're going to grow this. And they agreed. So about 6 months in, they started advertising and I just kept selling it. Long story short, I only have 4 ad slots available on my show because that's enough for an hour long or 40-minute long show. That's enough. And I sell that. I have an email newsletter that I sell space on. I do some social media. I hate social media, but I do advertise, I'll sell that. I mean, my bottom line, and we can talk more about monetization, but my bottom line is it's really, really important that you disclose. And it's important for people to know, like, this is a commercial. I don't sell the show. The content is not for sale. And what's interesting is I often have advertisers who do come on, like Dexcom is a perfect example. Dexcom is a longtime sponsor, but they make a continuous glucose monitor. So 2 or 3 times a year, somebody from that company comes on my show. And I always have to say, hey, as you listen, please recognize you heard a commercial from these guys. They paid for that. They're not paying for this interview. And then we do the interview. So I think it's important to always kind of disclose what's going on. But yeah, I do. I sell. That's a long answer. I sell commercials.
Oh, it's only because I hear a lot of newer podcasters, and I'm also intrigued myself just about how, not just about replacing an income, but producing a podcast isn't cheap. As you all know, there are expenses that go along with it. And it would be great for everyone who makes a podcast to be able to have those expenses covered.
All right. Well, let's talk about that. And I'm going to be very mean. Most podcasts are terrible, will not sell advertising, and have no audience. That was mean, and I'm really sorry. So let's talk about that. I heard years ago, I think it was the president of iHeartRadio. Somebody said listening to podcasts is like going to a flea market and there's a lot of garbage. And everybody was up in arms. Like, that's a terrible thing to say. It's true. It's true. There are 3 million podcasts now, and most of them are not being produced. Most of them have 2 episodes. Most of them are somebody who tried it and didn't really have a focus. I'm not going to be I'll stop there, but you know what I mean? Like, most of them aren't great. Now, the bottom line is your podcast doesn't actually have to be great to make money. All you need is an audience, because advertisers are not buying your show. They're buying your people, right? They want to reach the people that are listening. So, that's why, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. That's why in media for forever, the shock jock, the offensive people, even if they're hateful, why are they kept on the air? Because they make money, because audiences listen. That's not the example. That's not what I want us to follow, right? I want good, meaningful work here, but that was just an example that popped into my head. So if you're thinking of monetizing your show, just recognize that what you're really monetizing is your audience. So you need to know how many people are listening, who's listening, who's interested in reaching them. And again, your show doesn't have to make money, but if you want it to, that's one way to go. The other way is subscription, but I personally have never paid for a podcast, and I don't think, unless you're a big, big celebrity, that's the way to go. I don't know. I felt like I was very mean, Alison. I'm sorry.
Well, sometimes you do have to, rip off that Band-Aid and be a little, I wouldn't say mean, but honest. And as you say, there are over 3 million podcasts. I sometimes just type in a word into the Apple Podcast app just to see if there is a podcast about a subject. And sometimes you'll see that there's one and they'll have 0 episodes.
Yeah.
It's like they've claimed their space. And it was, years ago. It's like, why would you do that? In fact, the name of my podcast, Women Who Podcast, there is another show called Women Who Podcast, but they've only done like 2 episodes and haven't done anything for over 3 years. So I thought I could have the same name and put my own spin on it, and people will find me because I'm active. This will be over 80 episodes by now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. Yeah.
No,
it isn't. Good.
I'm not the greatest podcaster out there by any stretch.
No, but it's a perfect example, right? Of somebody who started and fell off for whatever reason. And that happens, right? Maybe they were just done, or maybe, it wasn't for them anymore. Life gets busy. Something else to keep in mind when you're selling a show is, I've heard a lot that you need 5,000 listeners or 5,000 downloads per episode after 5 or 6 weeks. That's the measurement to look at. And that's true if you have a very general show, right? If there's no niche, if you can sell anything on that show, that's the number to look for. But if you have a very specific show, like you do, let's make one up, a travel show aimed at women between the ages of 50 and 70 who would like to hike in cloudy weather. That's silly, but very specific, right? Then you need maybe 500 listeners per episode. And you can sell to a travel company or luggage, or, the people that are looking for that specific demographic. You think about like new parents and all the crap that they need and buy. So like new parents, that's a fantastic demographic to throw a podcast at, because the people that are trying to reach them and sell stuff to them is massive. So if you start thinking about it that way, I mean, I still think you should podcast about whatever you're passionate about. The last thing you need to do is engineer a show from the advertising backward. Like, what a disaster that would be. But I'm just giving that as examples. Like a show with type 1 diabetes, I don't need 5,000 listeners because to sell advertising on my show, because my people are hard to reach. And there are products that are aimed to them. Right. So I have had some episodes that have had more than 5,000 downloads, which is awesome, but that's not my regular audience. It's really interesting. I mean, it's just one of those things where the nichier you are, the easier it is to sell.
And your advertisers, you've done them a favor because you've got all those potential customers in the one space ready for them. But you've done the hard work.
I have done the hard work. And that's why, when you go to price your ads, you don't want to undersell yourself.
I was reading that you also have done things off air for your community. You've had, was it an overnight conference for mums of type 1 children?
Oh my gosh. Thank you for asking me about this. I'm so excited about this. We started this in January of 2023. So I started Diabetes Connections Presents Mom's Night Out. And this is a 2-day conference for moms of kids with diabetes. I started it where I live here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it was supposed to be a book launch. I've written 2 books about raising a kid with diabetes. And the second one, they're called The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, and then Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom. And the second one, I was supposed to have a launch party, but I wanted to make it more of an educational thing. So I invited educators and the technology companies, and we had cocktails, and it was really fun. But it was supposed to be a one and done. And then after we did it, and of course I posted it all over social media, I heard from moms all over the country and some in Canada and the UK who were like, come here. So we decided to try to do this. So I'm doing about 4 a year now. We're in Chicago in the spring, and then in the fall, we're in Denver and Philadelphia. We already were in Charlotte again this past year. And then next year, we're just in the process of picking our cities. And it's pretty wild. It's been great. It's a small conference just for moms. And it's all the things that were in the first one: great speakers, education, a chance to meet one-on-one with an educator. And what's different is, moms, and I wish I could do something for dads, and I wish I could do something for teens, and I wish I could do something for everybody with type 1. But in general, moms are the main caregiver for these kids, and they never get any time away. They're tied to, the kid has a chronic condition. It's really hard to get away. So this kind of forces them away. The dad can watch them, a babysitter can watch them, grandma can watch them. And then when their attention is not only on their child's blood sugar, then they're kind of free to learn and laugh and find other women in their area who can support them. So it's been a dream come true. Thank you for asking about it. It really has been amazing for me.
It's a way of taking your podcast audience and bringing them all together. So that community off air, which I love.
Yeah. And we started, it's kind of full circle, because we started taping the speakers. So, and one of the speakers didn't have time to do a full speech. She hosts her own podcast called Pantsuit Politics. And she came to the event and was like, I said, how about I just interview you at the event? So we taped that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to tape everybody. That was Sarah Stewart Holland when she came to our event in Charlotte. And that was great. So now we're doing in person from the podcast, and then we're recycling it and using the in person for the podcast.
Well, that is a really good way of using what you've got. And, it's showing all the different things that you can do with the podcast. You've mentioned your advertising, but then you've got an in-person event, and you've multiple Facebook groups where you're in contact with your listeners. So you're doing podcasting in the way I think that a lot of us would like to be doing.
Oh, look, let's be honest. I'm very, very, very lucky. I started this show when I had no job. I had left my career because I was tired of getting up at 2:30 in the morning or 3:30 in the morning, whatever. I can't even remember, but it was terrible. So I stopped getting up in the middle of the night. My husband had a full-time job, so I had the flexibility to do this and to give it attention. But I wanted something that I worked about 20 hours a week on because my kids were still around. And over time, I was able to build it to the point where, my kids are both away. My daughter is grown. My son is in college. So I'm able to give this a lot of time and attention, and it has become my job. So I never want anybody to think like, oh, if you're working on this 4 hours a week after your full-time job, you should be able to do all these things, because you can't. And I also had the financial stability of my husband having a job. So let's be real about it. Honestly, I'm glad I did it. I feel like I've been very successful at it, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. So if you're just starting out and you're listening, just definitely be kind to yourself. Give yourself some time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that full disclosure too, because you do see a lot of people who are very successful, but you don't hear all the other things that happen in the background to make it a success.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't know a lot of people who are not celebrities who have become quick success stories with podcasting. I mean, it happens, but it takes some time and it takes some effort. And usually, we need healthcare insurance here in the US, so somebody's got a job.
You mentioned right at the beginning that when your son had his diagnosis at the start, you were already listening to podcasts. And I can tell that you are, prolific at, your podcast listening. You do like to listen to podcasts. Can you tell us a couple of your favorites?
Sure. So I'll mention Pantsuit Politics, which Sarah Stewart Holland is one of the hosts. Her son was diagnosed with type 1 about 2 years ago, which is how we got connected. And they are like a different approach to the news, is how they like to say it. There's nobody screaming and yelling about politics. That's probably one of the few political shows that I'd recommend. This is kind of embarrassing. I listen to a lot of Game of Thrones podcasts, even now, because I read the books a million years ago and I'm still obsessed with them. So I still listen to Radio Westeros and History of Westeros. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. I love those shows. I love On with Kara Swisher. And Kara Swisher also co-hosts Pivot. I love that show. I like Kara. I don't agree with everything they say. And it's a business and tech podcast. But I like her as a broadcast role model for women. I think she is very confident, very straightforward. If you're thinking, how do I do an interview? She is an incredible interviewer. And her philosophy, which I've tried to adopt, is you have to treat every interview like you do not care if that person ever comes back on your show. You can't pussyfoot around stuff. You can be polite about it, but you've got to act right. And she also, I can't always do this, but she always starts, she says, by asking the question that's on everybody's mind. So sometimes like you warm somebody up. I don't know if you know how, as you listen with interviewing techniques, but usually you're like, hey, let's talk about something successful. And then let's talk about something intriguing. And then let's talk about the elephant in the room that's really unpleasant, And she just, I almost knocked my microphone over. I got so excited, but she just goes right in, so she does that. And then I listen to some comedy podcasts. I like, what's it called? Oh, How Did This Get Made is absolutely ridiculous. So, and I like Maintenance Phase. Maintenance Phase is a really funny show, but also very serious look into diet culture. That's really interesting. So those are all, I got a million. I was scrolling through my shows. I listen to way too many podcasts. And all the diabetes shows. Come to me for diabetes show recommendations if you need those.
There are, as you say, loads of different podcasts for all sorts. And yeah, it's great to hear that you've also got a nice eclectic mix of podcasts in your playlist. You mentioned Game of Thrones. I listen to an Outlander podcast. That's my guilty pleasure.
Years ago, when people didn't really understand podcasting, and they would say, well, I don't get it. What should I listen to? I would always say, what TV show do you like? Because there was always a podcast. There's usually an official podcast. There's a fan podcast, something with the TV shows. That's always a good point of entry, I think. That's funny. There was a great one for HBO Succession, which I'll say it's great because Kara Swisher hosted it. I sound like a Kara Swisher fangirl. But a lot of TV shows, I don't know how yours is, when they're the official show, they're very like, this show is so great. Or the cast members will say things like, I can't believe we get to be part of such an important and wonderful project. And this was not like it at all. It was great. She would always try to find something really unusual and then bring in a real life person and say like, they had this insane party that obviously cost millions of dollars. So she got like a party planner to very rich people and said, could this have happened? And he's like, not only could it happen, here's some more horrible things that I have done at parties. Like, it was so interesting. So,
yeah.
I like that.
I had the hosts of Podlander Drunkcast on my show last year, and they said that their favorite review that they had on Apple was, we get it, you hate this show. Because yeah, as you were a fan watching the show, you can criticize it. And I think you should.
It's got to be honest. If every single person is saying, I'm so honored to be part of this show. That's a boring podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've taken up so much of your time, Stacey. It's been great to have you on. But before we do wrap up, I did want to ask you what tip you would give. I mean, you've already shared so much gold, but for women podcasters who are just starting out or are still in the thinking about having a podcast, what have you learned that you can share with them?
I would definitely say that, do your research, get ready, find what you need, and don't ask a guy. I mean, really don't ask them. I love there's I'm not like a man hater kind of person, but there's something about podcast guys that they feel like they know so much better than you. I would highly recommend you join a community that's full of women who podcast. Listen to this show, right? Or find somebody like yourself because it's going to sound kind of silly. And I'm not even talking about like worrying that a man would say, you shouldn't do it. That's not what I mean. But like microphones are different for women. Our voices sound different in different microphones. Most microphones are built for men and always have been. What women want to podcast about and why we want to podcast is, broadly speaking, very different, right? Our goals are different. The way we are able to podcast around our kids, right? We have to schedule things differently. We have to be flexible in different ways. It's just a different experience. And so I would say, be open, listen to lots of opinions, but don't be afraid to realize that there is a different way to do this. Elsie Escobar is a wonderful person to follow on Threads and Twitter and everywhere else. She's with Libsyn. And I don't recommend her because Libsyn is a podcast hosting company. But Elsie's been at this, I think she had her show in 2004. She's been at this a very long time and she's leaned in really hard to talk about women in podcasting. And I think she's just incredible in pointing out some of these differences. So, look, let's just acknowledge it. Let's talk about it. And then the way you do your show will be uniquely yours. And it doesn't have to be a male or female type thing. But I think recognizing that it is different for many people is just eye opening in and of itself.
That's such a great note to finish this on, Stacey. I really appreciate having you on, and yeah, just the connection we made through Threads. So listeners, go and hang out on Threads. It's a cool social media place to be. I'll have all your links in the show notes, so don't have to worry about that. But yeah, thank you so much again, Stacey. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Thanks again, Stacey, for this conversation. There's so much to unpack in this chat with Stacey, including the permission to launch a podcast of just 6 episodes. And is there anyone now thinking about potential sponsors based on their niche? That was a really interesting take on monetizing because I've heard a lot about podcasters selling their own courses or coaching to listeners and not so much about getting sponsors on. But Stacey is showing that you can make a podcast that appeals to sponsors. It all depends on your topic and your audience. You'll know from listening that this podcast doesn't have sponsors. Maybe that's something I can think about more. As we mentioned in our chat, Stacey and I connected via Threads. If you're not over there yet, I'm finding that a lot of podcasters are hanging out there, sharing what's working, what they're trying next, etc., etc. I'm on Threads as Alison the Podcaster, if you want to look me up. I'm not very prolific at posting, but I do like to add to other conversations. Currently, I'm working out where I want to be on social media, and I've not been posting much at all about this podcast. So, if you found me another way, please do let me know where so I can double down on my efforts. You can contact me at alison@alisonfraser.co and see if I can help you over at www.alisonfraser.co, whether that's through a Pick My Brain call, joining a productivity pod, or something else. All links to Stacey and the podcast she mentions are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. That's it from me this week, and I'll speak to you again soon.